Hey guys, good evening, and I hope everyone's doing really well with the last few minutes of submissions. Um, my topic today is I'm Obedla, and I'm going to talk to you about the one child policy and its effect on the male dominated China and how it has affected the socioeconomic structure with regards to the population as a whole and then gender in specific. Um, Now, the one child policy, though generally perceived to have been codified as a law in 1979, was something that Mao Zedong actually started way earlier, and he kept pushing campaigns for family planning, but there was no actual penalty assigned to having more than one child or multiple children in general. But in 1979, with one Chinese social scholar going to Europe, he went through a few equations. He figured out that it was really bad for China to have so many people, so he came back, the law was codified and eventually put into practice. Now, what happens when you have more than one child in China? Um, there are multiple punishments depending where you are, and so it ranges from penalties, financial penalties, to actually ruining your prospects in the job market, where you're not promoted, you're mostly demoted. You don't get your welfare for your childcare, as well as other ramifications for your children. So they don't get access to schools on priority, to colleges for healthcare, and all of that is how China has tried to control this. Now, this essay generally tries to, or the essay and this general topic, I'm going to break it down into two major points. One is the underpopulation syndrome and how that affects the population in general of China. And then we'll discuss on a second level the gendered selection that has been happening in China and its effects on the population, and gender in specific of both male and female. Now, breaking down into underpopulation, you would generally perceive that when a country is underpopulated or less populated, it would be better off. But the term underpopulation does not necessarily mean lesser population. Now, underpopulation means when you have lesser resources, you have more resources, lesser people, and generally the question that came to my mind initially was, how is that bad? I thought that was always supposed to be good. Now, generally what happens with policies such as ones where you curtail populations, where you have low fertility rates, or being underpopulated and its effects on economy. Now, there's a period called a momentum period, and that's when you take off a policy. There's a good honeymoon phase in between where you actually think the policy is working and it's beneficial, but in the long run, it starts to affect the general growth of the population. Now, with underpopulation, we see that though there will be a lot more resources than people, but the idea is the median age is increasing in China. The fertility rate is very low, and now that what that would lead to is more people who are retired. And when you have more people who are retired and a lot of funds, generally when you don't have labor to reproduce those funds, it's detrimental for the society's economy in general. And China is a very labor oriented country nonetheless, so with their labor diminishing, it's actually bad for them. um, but looking at it from a more gendered perspective, when we look at the general idea of gender selection, now in China there was always this preference for males. It's a global um, it's a global. The term would be it's a global general culture of patriarchy in general, but in China it was a bit on steroids. Now the idea was that they were obsessed with the male heir concept. So families would have multiple children to ensure that they ended up with a male child, because of the idea that women get married and then eventually have another family's surname, and the idea that men tend to end up providing for older parents eventually, whereas daughters don't. So China kept trying to do that, and they would do that through multiple children, abortion, so on and so forth. But with gendered selection, the ability of figuring out your baby's gender and having the fetus removed if it were a woman has led to China having the second highest disparity rate between male and female populations. Um, and that has been bad. That's been bad on multiple levels. One of the first levels, especially when we look at it from male perspective, it has been bad because there are a lot of dependence on a working class man. Um, Studies show that in 2050, you'd have every 10 workers would have 7 dependents who are either too old or too young, and depend on on those workers. And in China, generally, they'd be more older people. Um, so that pressure on one end. The second pressure is because of this disparity, it's very hard to find brides, so people need to get married, so they're saving up, since there's women are in demand, so it's more costlier to get married. So men are saving up, the society pressure engaged on that end is one thing. But on the other end, generally, traditionally, it has created this generation of people who are labeled as the little emperors. Now, as the name um, would sort of um, suggest, is the fact that these people actually act like they're emperors, because they're the one child in the whole family is generally fed everything that the family has. They're extremely pampered. It has led to a generation of really greedy people. Now, this greedy generation in general has had a lot of health issues. Now, the health issues include obesity, diabetes, as well as cardiovascular diseases, and this is all because they're being overfed. And all of that has been bad and detrimental to the male population's health in general. But if you look at it from the other perspective of the female perspective in this disparity, now the idea is, it's put women in a very bad spot, whereas they're generally undesired in society. Though China, as a developing country, does give enough opportunities to women, but the idea is these mothers who are giving birth to children, they're not being given a choice, and there have been women who've been forced to have abortions. Families force them, the governments force them, and even when they don't um, intend to lose the second child. So that's generally people who have gone through with their labor, are people who've tended to go to alternative healthcare facilities, and it has caused mothers' deaths. It has caused high rates of suicide in China, which are at an alarming rate. And in general, those problems coming together have hurt the image of women in general in that country. But it hasn't been all that bad for women. Now, such radical policy has had surprising good effects on, and the disparity has actually benefited the female population at some ends. A women are financially better off. They're not in a rush to marry because of the availability of so many men out there. And on the third level, the idea is that women actually have had more liberty with regards to their marriages, and they've been divorcing more often. And within a culture like China's, where it's traditionally looked down upon, and it's taboo in the society to be divorced, Chinese women are divorcing their husbands more often, and that's worked in their favor. Um, so in general, it just shows that policies that might appear very simple, and the one child policy, even though wasn't actually a law, it was just something that was dictated to all the party members, the Communist Party members, and it's been practiced ever since, um, has had such long-term effects. And though China has removed its one-child policy and believes that all these effects will be reversed, the idea is with the scale, and the fact that this was initially intended to be a one-generation policy and was extended to almost 35 years, the effects of these might just as well not be reversible naturally, and maybe the Chinese government needs to take active steps into ensuring a certain equal society, and address the gender disparity and the underpopulation, um, if it plans on eventually becoming the world hegemon. I hope it makes sense. Thanks so much for listening to me. Bye.